Arthurian lore meets a modernized yet old school The Elder Scrolls seems like a promising premise for a new RPG adventure. And that's what convinced me to try Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. Throughout my 50 hours spent completing this holdover for The Elder Scrolls 6, I was met with ups, with downs, surprises, and disappointments. Is Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon an adequate appetite suppressant for those starved for a new entry in Bethesda's famed franchise, or a flat-footed attempt to cash in on the 15-plus year gap between TES releases? Hang out for this brief, no BS, boredom-free review of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. I am GreyDay. I play games. This is GreyDayGames. Let's cut to the chase. I hated hours 2 to 15 of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. I was frustrated, I was disappointed. Thankfully that changed, and I actually had a good time in the 50 hours I spent finishing the game. But so often I found my joy interrupted by things such as story pacing, inconsistencies, bugs, poor quality of life considerations. Things that don't directly impact the gameplay, but rather mar the enjoyability of the overall experience. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is a game that left me in a constant state of fluctuation between love and loathing. Having felt this feeling before, I decided that, just like my many failed relationships, I would stick it out to the end regardless of my many moments of misery I endured in the process. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is a game I would readily recommend to some gamers, while warily warning others. We're going to cover the areas in which Tainted Grail both fails and flourishes, and by the end of this video, you'll know whether or not you'll find the game to be a diamond in the rough, or just a fossilized turd. As always, we start with the presentation. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is a beautiful game. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is a terrible looking game. I'm not bipolar, we're just right both times. Understandably, the game's aesthetic uses classic TES as its quote-unquote inspiration. Unfortunately, the inconsistencies in the graphics really tear you away from the believability of perceived realism inside the structure of the art style. When you go from beautiful scenery such as this, to broken visuals or terribly rendered cutscenes like this digital diarrhea, it's hard to feel good about the game's visuals as a whole. To be fair, I found myself muttering, "This game is so damn pretty," more often than, "What is this shit?" But the game's visual failures, coupled with the plentiful visual glitches, stiff and lifeless animations, especially during conversational dialogue, it all just adds up to diminish what could have been a solid homage to the look and feel of the Elder Scrolls, Oblivion, and Skyrim. I guess some will say that these inconsistencies only go to further the classic Elder Scrolls game experience, but to them I'd say, you're wrong, nerds. While the visuals in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon are inconsistent and a little lackluster, the audio is a surprise hit. From the natural ambiance of traversing the open map, the sounds of cities, the clanks of combat, to the music and voice acting, Tainted Grail does everything it needs to keep you excited and engrossed in the experience. Due to the overall unpolished nature of the game, some audio glitches did frequently recur, such as combat music doubling up or playing long after the potential threat has been eliminated as a source of harm. The cutscene and conversational dialogue is voice acted and very well done too. I wouldn't say that the voice acting compares to recent hits such as Clair Obscur Expedition 33 or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, but I never scoffed at a voice actor's effort throughout my gameplay, and that says a lot for a low-budget game such as Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. The story in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is interesting. The TLDR is, Amnesiac gets busted out of an insane asylum and tasked to re-resurrect King Arthur by obtaining the pieces of his soul so that the person who busted you out may slay the undead king to stop the perpetual cycle of his reanimation. Honestly, I initially enjoyed this premise, with the first few hours being very heavy with lore and backstory, meetings and conversations with a disembodied King Arthur, and stories of Merlin and the Knights of the Round Table. Unfortunately, the game seems to sputter out on this Arthurian lore for the majority of the mid-game, only coming back to it in the oddly paced third act. When you're nearing the completion of the game, it feels like all of your choices get distilled down to a few story paths that essentially decided upon the last few hours through dialogue options. The writing in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon was a real winner. The well-delivered dialogue is edgy, witty, funny. It is dialogue that feels written for adult gamers, by adult gamers, and that's something I don't think we get enough of these days. In my 50-hour playthrough, I didn't find too many things to gripe about the story, and had many memorable moments that still put a smirk on my face as I write this script. I'm looking at you, dude who was cursed to be frozen in a T-pose. That shit was funny. combat in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is pretty much a winner when compared to the classic TES games, including the recently released Oblivion remaster. Fighting animations are decent, and with a few exceptions, provide enemy movesets that make combat more challenging than "don't run out of stamina or mana." Because Tainted Grail is a give and take in every facet of its existence, these acceptable animations are overshadowed by the pretty lackluster finisher animations and the typical buggy jank I've mentioned previously. With those issues aside, the combat felt fun and impactful, with a useful dodge, a parry I never mastered, and a good variety of the type of weapons and armors you'd expect from an adventure RPG, and not to forget, a very useful time dilation ability I ended up calling Arthur Power. When you're going into battle at the proper level, combat in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon feels great, and was a big part in my ability to finish this game. Exploration is enjoyable as well. Secret quests, hidden gear, and things to harvest abound in the relatively small 3 main areas of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. With no stamina drain from running outside of combat, players are able to sprint across the map at a speed that more or less makes riding horseback pointless. With our fast feet and plentiful fast travel locations, and fast loading times on a modern SSD, you never feel bogged down by a long trek, unless you choose to play it slow and be bogged down by long treks. Harvesting resources is as straightforward as any game in the genre, except when it comes to the resupply of the gathering points, and the availability of the important gathering points. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to have to travel to 30 different spots to gather enough sage to make enough worthwhile healing potions to tackle the next boss, or to travel to one of the 3 places that you know to gather the very important meteorite ore, only to find out that they haven't refreshed yet. Crafting in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon it's okay. Nothing stands out except a strict failure rate that will force you to endure painfully drawn out side quests if you're not smart enough about leveling up your crafting before attempting to forge gear out of pieces of slain monsters that seemingly don't drop when you freaking need them. It's fun. 9 out of 10 drowners don't have tongues. I'm sure there's a lore explanation for that. It's fine. I often faced a frustrating bug or oversight that when crafting, I could not see how many of a thing I needed to craft an item. I also was not made aware why something wouldn't level up, which is usually because I didn't have enough gold. Gameplay frustrations were a common thing throughout my session with Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. I always felt starved for gold and resources with no meaningful way to ever get ahead. The cost of upgrading weapons or armor, adding rune slots, it adds up so quickly, and there's very little worth selling in the mid to late game that would ever earn you enough to get the weapon upgrade that would make your build just right. I was frustrated early on when I found myself completely underleveled, getting absolutely stomped in the early game because the bounties that I was receiving weren't rewarding, and I missed a bunch of optional quests.
Well, then stop being stupid and talk to people like you're supposed to, Gray.
Hey, stop it. I did talk to people. However, when you highlight dialogue options as a developer, as a modern gamer, I've been trained to think that that's the one and only option that's important to continue the quest. To be fair, the non-highlighted dialogue option of "do you have any work for me" is telling, yes, but you highlighted something. I never looked at that other option until I forced myself to get back and finish the game for my review after nearly writing it off as a failed endeavor. I did not appreciate the fact that adventuring during the night was a non-starter. Do so, and you'll find yourself getting hunted by a faster and far more powerful enemy that will have you slain before you can say, "I wish I were in Skyrim." I didn't appreciate that before going live, the developer disabled the player's home in a town where I would have benefited from a good night's sleep. Instead, I spent an hour or two trying to figure out why I couldn't enter a place labeled home on my map. In the end, there were many things I found to be disappointed in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. But it's strange. I feel like I'm being specifically critical because deep down, there's a really cool game here. A game that shows a potentially bright future for developer questline. You're a gamer who longs for a game that presents a great value, who still loves the classic Bethesda The Elder Scrolls formula, who can overlook jank, glitches, bugs, incomplete features to find the kernel of goodness in a game. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon might just be what you've been looking for. If you've never heard of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, if the only The Elder Scrolls game you've ever enjoyed was Skyrim, if you prefer a streamlined game that features modern sensibilities of AAA games, if you've tried out Oblivion Remastered on Game Pass and thought, yeah, this feels janky AF no cap, you're likely to have a hard time getting through this one. Final verdict. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon was a game I loved, then hated. Loved, then hated again. And while I might not be the most mentally stable fella out there, and I'm not the most patient person, I feel that many will agree with the fact that Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is itself tainted by its own lack of consistency and polish. What lies underneath its failures is an enjoyable, witty, and entertaining game that will be a joy for hardcore fans of the genre, and a gamble for those who are not. The great news is that, if after this review you find yourself curious, a demo is available for PC and current-gen consoles, so give it a shot for yourself and let me know your thoughts in the comments. With some work, I'd give Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon a half point more, but for now, as it stands, it has earned a 7.5. If you found this review helpful, a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button would brighten my day. If you hated it, let me know how much I suck and what I could do better in the comments. Just a reminder that I stream most of my review playthroughs on Twitch at GreyDayGames and here on YouTube at GreyDayPlays. I am GreyDay. I play games. This